My name is Kendall Gelner, and I'm here today to talk to you about advanced StoreKit testing with Xcode 12 and iOS 14. Apple has added a lot of new features and testing abilities around these particular improvements, and so I want to go through with those with you. Now, just a little about me. I am currently an iOS developer with a company called Nami ML. And what we do is we have an SDK that handles StoreKit and paywall kind of things in our framework so that people don't have to worry about that. And I've been with them now for a number of years. Before that, for a long time, I was an iOS consultant. And through all this, I've worked with a lot of different applications handling payment things, especially, but just all kinds of different application aspects. And so I've been an iOS developer for a very long time and have spoken also about Xcode a lot. So I enjoy kind of working through what kinds of things you can do in Xcode and how you can make the best use of that tool. Now, what in particular has changed with Xcode 12 and iOS 14 that makes this sort of advanced and exciting? So it's not just new tools. Xcode, over time, it does add new tools, and those are always fun. But it's also that Apple is kind of fundamentally has a new process for actually doing purchase development. So in the past, they've kind of had one way that you kind of developed purchases from scratch, and now that's changed a bit. So we'll explore that along with how the new tools make possible new kinds of testing that wasn't even possible before, which is also another aspect of this that's really great. As part of this, I just want to talk through StoreKit. I'm not actually going to go through any StoreKit code for this presentation because this is really more about just the tools and testing of the thing. And the transaction handling stuff, there's other things that can show you how to do that. Or like I said, there's libraries, there's our company and other libraries too that can help you handle StoreKit transactions. But just it's good to be aware of how StoreKit works in order to understand what the testing tools are telling you and how to work with them. So fundamentally, StoreKit is the iOS system that handles purchases, and it's the way that that system, iTunes, talks to your application in regards to what purchase activity has happened. And that happens through transactions. So StoreKit will be sending transactions to your application. You set up a listener in your application and receive these transactions, and then decide what to do based on these, how to message the user about what has happened. And eventually, the end goal, of course, is that if the user purchases something, you want them to have access to some functionality that you're enabling by that purchase. They also have a receipt. This is kind of outside the scope of our talk, but just be aware that StoreKit and iOS just has a receipt that gets handed to your application, and you can use that to kind of verify purchases have occurred and see what purchases has occurred in the past. Now, also, as part of this, the StoreKit, there's kind of this device sandbox notion. And what this is the thought that you can test purchases on a device and they don't actually go to real iTunes Store. You can test purchases and it doesn't charge you or anything, and you can test them again and again and go through different scenarios. In the past, that was pretty primitive, and you could really just test basic purchases and try a few simple things. And that's really improved a lot before, as we'll see shortly. So how has the purchase flow changed? I'm going to just go briefly through the old flow and how that worked. So the old way that you would develop purchases is first thing you would do is define products in App Store Connect. So you'd have to go on the website, log in, set up whatever products you wanted to test up there for your application. And then you could build a StoreKit listener like I was talking about. And you would also load products from StoreKit using skProduct. You would do product requests and get product information and display that. You could check that in the simulator. The simulator would load products through StoreKit from App Store Connect and display them properly, but you couldn't really test purchases there. And that's where you had to go to the device to actually do Sandbox account testing. And that used a dialogue that looked nothing like what the user actually used to purchase things. It was this kind of sort of crude looking dialogue you used to buy and actually activate a purchase. And then that would, send the transactions to your application and you would react to them there as you would normally, but you could only do that on device for testing purchases. In some cases, if you wanted to reset the sandbox for some reason, like you had a subscription with an introductory offer, you wanted to test that again, had to create a whole new testing account and redo that again. And there were just some things you couldn't even test, like deferred and interrupted purchases, which I'll talk more about in a bit. So the new way that you do this is you actually start out in Xcode now. You don't have to go to App Store Connect to start. You create a StoreKit configuration file in Xcode, which is pretty cool. So you have that, and you can then implement the StoreKit transaction call handling as normal, but then you activate the StoreKit configuration for your application when you run it, if you choose to or not. And you can present products now from StoreKit, but this information that you're presenting, you get an SK product, but that information comes from this configuration file that you've defined that has the product information. So you don't have to go up to App Store Connect to start playing around with product kind of things right away. You can test purchases in simulator or device now. So you can actually make a purchase in the simulator and you can test it right there, and you don't have to go on the device to test that. And in addition to that, there's also further purchase scenarios you can now test, which is greatly expanded over what you could do before. And we'll go into that, how you actually make use of that. But there's a new transaction window that you can view transactions and other editor options too to handle different kinds of purchase testing, which is pretty cool. So part of this new flow also is that, when you're finally done with this local testing, you do go back to App Store Connect and you set up the products finally, probably using the same information that you started with in Xcode, but maybe not. You can set up more complex stuff on App Store Connect for the final versions of the products you're going to release. You're going to deactivate the StoreKit configuration in that scheme, and you're going to test on the iOS14 device now all of these kind of purchase scenarios that you were testing before in the simulator. You can also test them on device too. And you can use it uses the real system purchase sheet with real purchases from the App Store Connect. So that's an important aspect of testing, is to do a final test using App Store Connect products that you've defined. And even on device now, you can also modify things like subscription details or just subscriptions without having to create new test accounts. And so that's very cool. So this configuration file, what is this like and how do you work with it? So you go into New File, StoreKit Configuration within your project, and this will create a StoreKit configuration file. You can kind of filter this down. There's a lot of stuff in here. Just be aware. It's called StoreKit Configuration File. When it comes up with a prompt to add it to your project, you'll see that you have the ability to add it to your targets, but you don't need to. It doesn't need to be in a target for your application to work. It can just be sitting there in the Xcode project. For subscription products, you can create a group and then a product once you have this configuration file. For non-subscription products, create the product and just fill in details. And really that's true for either kinds of product. Localization you'll want to add, and it's just for text, not for pricing. You just have to add a localization there. It actually doesn't have the ability to add localization for pricing. So it will just display whatever price you choose, I think, with whatever localization you choose, which I'll get to that later. But just fill in as much, you just need a handful of details. The key one is the product ID. Make sure to use the same product ID you'll be using in the end. So kind of think through how you want your product IDs and just make sure that is what you want. The reference name doesn't ever appear in anything the user sees, so that could be anything you want. Here I've just used the same as the product ID just for simplicity, but you can make it something more meaningful if you want. For product creation, you don't have to also create all the products you plan to use too. Just be aware, like if you're pulling in products that you have existing in App Store Connect because you want to test them locally, you can just do a handful of them. You don't have to pull them all over to test. At least have two if you have subscriptions. That's kind of useful to have, to be able to change between them and just test things. And it makes it very easy to add introductory offers here in this local kind of product definition version. So might as well just throw them in and try testing that kind of scenario too, and then maybe add that to your app later in App Store Connect. You have most of the same fields you have here, so just be aware that when you're defining these products, you can pretty much just move the information pretty straightforwardly between App Store Connect and this product entry screen in the configuration. So now that we have this config, how do we actually make use of this when we run? And the way that you do that is through edit scheme. I mentioned this before, but the actual location you do this is there's the drop down that's right next to the top level control bar. And you can drop that down and select to edit scheme for a current scheme that you have selected. within that scheme and run, there's an option where you can select which StoreKit configuration you want to use. You can have more than one. And so that's kind of useful that you could have maybe different kinds of products set up for testing different things. Something that I like to do is actually duplicate the scheme. And the reason I do that is I can have then one scheme with a StoreKit configuration set up in it, and one scheme that is for device testing in the Sandbox. And that way I can quickly toggle between them without having to go down into the scheme editing box to change that back and forth. Then also, once you have the scheme loaded and you're running, again, like this will just use, you can just use StoreKit like normal. You don't have to do anything different or new to actually make use of the configuration file you've defined. Once this is running, you can just register a listener, use load SK products like normal, and it will just all come from this local configuration file. You can alter that too anytime you wish, and the information will change in the products that you load too. So that you can test out quickly, changing around localizations and other things like that. And also purchases are just like normal. You would tell StoreKit to initiate a purchase just as you would, and in the simulator or on device when you are using a configuration. And you'll see the real system confirmation dialog pop up, which is really cool because the system confirmation dialog actually really leaves your application when these occur. So now you can really test to make sure your application handles okay the fact that your application has technically been suspended and then resumed once the purchase process is through in the confirmation. And these things locally, just to let you know while you're using the config, the purchases don't go up to the normal iTunes Sandbox. They just happen locally in Xcode, including even receipt generation. So I mentioned that there's sort of new tools. Now that we have this configuration and we know how to activate it and use it, how do we make use of it? We just go through, and there's two different sort of areas where there are new tools. One of them that's an important one to know about is the transactions window. And this is under the debug menu. Now at the very bottom of debug menu, there's a StoreKit option, and you can open a manage transactions window. And this is where transactions that your application is sent by StoreKit will appear. So you can kind of review what is happening and modify them too, as you wish. Now, be aware that you should see transactions happen here. This whole Xcode testing thing is maybe a little buggy at times. I had in the initial version, the release version of Xcode, I did not see transactions appear in this window for any purchases. If that happens, maybe try switching to a newer version of Xcode or a beta version of Xcode, but just be aware this is still all kind of beta stuff. And so you might need to tweak this a bit with how it runs, or just be aware that there might be some bugs like that. For the StoreKit editor menu, in Xcode, when you change different kinds of files that you're looking at, this editor menu will change to offer different options. When you're coding, it does different things, and this is true also of the StoreKit configuration. While you have the StoreKit configuration file up, if you go up to editor, you'll see these kinds of options for manipulating purchases and manipulating transactions. And you can use this to test different scenarios, which I'll get into later, how you can make use of these for different kinds of things you'd want to test. But just be aware this editor menu is here. Apple might add more even to this over time. And you have to have the StoreKit configuration file open to be able to see this. On the device test account, iOS14 has added, like I said, this whole new subscription modification screen where you could go into Settings, App Store, and then select your testing account. Once you've actually run and made a purchase on an application, that will appear with a Sandbox account, and you can use that to modify testing, subscriptions, and other kinds of purchase information here. And this is much better than before. You don't have to create a new account to reset eligibility for introductory offers and things like that. You can just do it through this screen, but be aware that this is here, and this also might improve or have stuff added over time too. Okay, that's great. So now that we have gone through, we know how to add a config, we know where some of the dual tools are located, how do we actually make use of these to test different things? And what kinds of things do we want to test for? So this is kind of a simple list of the initial kinds of scenarios that I think are very useful to test for purchases in your application to make sure your application is reacting as you would expect and users would expect when things occur. The most basic one, of course, is success. So this is just the case where you go into an application, you hit confirm purchase after you have selected a purchase option, a product, and you'll see a purchase transaction come up in the transaction window, and your application will get a purchase transaction that you should react to. For subscriptions, it also has a subscription options button that appears. And just be aware that in the current version, Xcode 12.1 that I'm using, that actually causes a crash. Maybe that will work for you. I've noticed that some things for around this purchase testing work for some people and they don't for others. So again, this is all possibly buggy, and hopefully over the next few iterations of Xcode, they'll iron some of this out in short order, but that may not work for you, but it is there to modify subscriptions as they occur. For the next scenario, and this is actually kind of a key one that I think is really important to check for, is purchase failure by interrupted purchase. And the main way this can occur is if the user has billing detail issues. Either they have maybe a bad or expired credit card setup, or iTunes might just decide from time to time to double check with the user to make sure that their purchase information is correct. But either way, when that user goes to actually make a purchase and they confirm it, your application will be told the purchase failed, but they will be told that they need to correct billing details or go somewhere else to make a correction. And they will actually leave your application and go off and do that. So from your application standpoint, it looks initially like a failure, but at some later point after they correct billing details, your application will be come back to and receive a purchase transaction just as if the thing had succeeded. So be aware that when they come back to your application, it could be at any point in the application that they might have corrected this. And so an application purchase might happen any point in time, and you need to be able to react to that whenever that occurs at any point, and just make sure to grant a purchase, not even inside of just your purchase screens where you're expecting it. And to actually test this, the way that you do is you go up to the editor menu again. And again, you have to have the StoreKit configuration open to see that. And you enable interrupted purchases. And this will be enabled for as long as Xcode is open. And any purchase you make after you enable this will have this happen. The user will hit confirm, and they'll be told that the thing has actually failed. And you'll see a failed transaction occur in this transactions window that you can modify and see. And then the way that you can actually test the full scenario where the user corrected that is you can select this transaction, and either in the debug menu under StoreKit or using this icon that highlights when you have this also highlighted, you could hit resolve issues and actually see that resolve and turn to a purchase transaction and go back to your application and make sure it handled that correctly. The other kind of scenario, which is a little bit similar, is the deferred scenario. And this is where the user has asked to buy turned on their device, and that means that a parent is basically going to approve purchases. So when a user attempts to make a purchase, they will go in, select a product, it will get the system confirmation dialog, they'll say confirm, and then they're prompted to actually ask to make a purchase. You can enable this with enable ask to buy, just like you would enable interrupted purchases before in the editor menu. Now, this is, again, this is the kind of dialog that will come up in the simulator. It will ask you, note that it doesn't really have quite the same information that the real confirmation dialog would have with the product name and everything, but that's just like an artifact of the simulator, and that'll probably improve over time. You'll get what it called a pending approval, but it's actually a deferred transaction that gets sent to your application. So they've kind of named that in a bit of a confusing way because there is also a pending transaction that means something different. And again, just like you could correct billing issues before, now you can highlight this pending approval transaction, and you can either approve or decline it. In real life, it might never be approved or declined. They might just simply ignore this. And just be aware that these can actually fail silently, basically, that you'll never get another transaction again, and the whole thing will be gone after 24 hours. They won't be able to approve it anymore. So just be aware that in addition to approve and decline, just be prepared for the case where just nothing ever happens after the pending or deferred purchase and transaction goes through. Another simple scenario is canceled. And I just wanted to bring this up because this is where a user would go in and opt to maybe try and purchase something, and the purchase dialog would come up. And instead of hitting approve, they would actually decide they really didn't want to buy it at that point, and they would hit declined or canceled actually. And I just wanted to bring this up because, as you'll see in this screenshot, there's no transactions that appear. And this is one of the cases where Xcode is not actually displaying every transaction StoreKit is sending your application. Your StoreKit will send your application a failed transaction in the case they cancel out, but it won't actually appear in this transaction editing window, debugging window that Xcode offers. So just be aware that some transactions sent to your application do not appear in this window, and this is one of them. Mostly they do, but this is one of the cases where you don't see that in that window. For testing external purchases, this is actually kind of a case that's really covered also by testing that interrupted purchase. So you might as well test that because you kind of get this in addition. But just to, again, be aware that purchases can happen outside your application. The user might opt to select a subscription option from the App Store even before your application's ever even installed. And so there's all kinds of wacky ways in which a purchase might happen with your application closed or not even installed. And so at any moment in time when you open an application, you should be aware that there could be a purchase transaction, or you should even really be periodically checking receipts, because it could be that a user has purchased an application, an in-app purchase on another device, and now maybe they're loading up your app on a second device, and you should check the receipt for a transaction that happened in the past that wouldn't get sent to your transaction listener to activate purchases that might have occurred. So that's a good case to look for and parse the receipt too. And again, but it might happen also just as soon as the app opens, you'll get a purchase transaction. So just make sure that your listener is set up as soon as possible after your application starts up so that you can be processing transactions right away. Another scenario is refund. This is again where you just go in and you can select a purchase transaction, only you can opt to refund that transaction instead of doing something else. And it will just issue a refund right away, and you should see whatever happens in your application transactions occur so that you can kind of handle that scenario. Now, note that you can only refund subscriptions at the moment. That's because I think they do more in terms of sending transaction information to your application. You can't actually refund just normal in-app product purchases at the moment. Subscription expiration. This is where you can test, and currently you would really normally test subscription expiration by selecting that option, the manage subscriptions button within the transaction. But again, that crashes for me, so I can't really show the effects of that working. But something else to be aware around this is that you can alter the time rate. By default, the time rate in Xcode testing is set at real time. So if you have a month-long subscription, it would take a month to expire in Xcode before that would really go away and you'd see a renewal or a subscription expiration. But you can also alter that time rate using this editor menu again to change it to something more like a second a day. And that way you can quickly test, transactions renewing, subscriptions renewing, or subscriptions expiring, and just make sure that you have that scenario handled without spending a lot of time at it waiting for Xcode. As each renewal occurs, you'll see a new purchase transaction in this transaction editor. And again, the subscription options button is there. And that's actually the way that you would cancel it. By default, an auto-renewable subscription, in the past, if you were doing Sandbox testing, would not renew after 5 attempts to simulate a user actually ending the purchase. But in this newer sort of Xcode testing scenario, this will actually just keep auto-renewing forever until the end of time, until you actually manage the subscriptions. And since that doesn't work for me, I can't actually test that scenario at the moment, but that's how you would normally actually end a subscription. Otherwise, with a renewing subscription, it will just keep going and going and generate new purchase transactions every time. So subscription expiration, again, you would end that there and it would just keep going otherwise. For crossgrades, the way to handle this is either through, again, that subscription options button on the Xcode testing, or if you're testing on device, you can make use of this Sandbox testing account screen to actually select different options. And this is actually handled just the same way as it would be a normal user could go into subscription editing things to either cancel a subscription that auto renews, or they can change to a different period too. And so you can test that same scenario and make sure your application handles the change in subscription periods here, because it'll be notified of a new purchasing transaction with a different time period, so you can be kind of ready for it to expire at some different point in time. And just some other things to mention is that this new framework also handles testing subscription offers. Subscription offers are for winning back users. Introductory offers can only be offered to people that have never subscribed to your app before. If people have subscribed and let that cancel, or just canceled or not renewed, then they can be given introductory. They cannot be given introductory offers, but they can be given subscription offers. They're very complex, and so they're really beyond the scope of this talk, because you have to sign them in order to make use of them and actually let people use them. So we're not going to talk about that, but just be aware in the editor menu there are various options for testing subscription offers within your application too. You may also want to test localizations and storefront to just test, like, again, that your localizations really work, and especially that prices display in different currencies properly and that you've handled that okay. And the format of the price also changes as it should, because SK product has a lot of different options for formatting prices, and just you want to make sure you use those to display prices properly in any storefront. And there are receipts, like I mentioned, that's again beyond the scope of this talk, but if you want to actually validate them with Apple, you have to make use of this public certificate that is given to you through, again, the editor menu, that you can just download and use to actually sign receipts to do receipt validation. For Sandbox testing, there's just a few other lingering things I've kind of talked about a little bit off and on, but I just wanted to talk about how you create a Sandbox test account user. And the way that works is through App Store Connect, you go to Users and Access, and you can add a testing account in there. The option to add Sandbox users is at the very bottom left corner there. Again, in Users and Access, not within the application itself. So that is across a whole set of applications that you have. You could use a test account for purchases, again, and the way that this works is that when you initially make a purchase, when you're running the application on device and you don't have the scheme set to use a StoreKit configuration, if you don't have a testing account already set up, it will actually prompt you to log in under an iTunes Sandbox account that you've set up previously in App Store Connect. And so after you do that, that's when you can go into the App Store kind of settings screen and go select your Sandbox testing account to actually jump off to the other screen where you can modify purchases that you've made within your testing application in the Sandbox. For editing purchase transactions, again, you go into that screen. I've talked about that a little bit already, but once you select that Sandbox testing account user, it will show you the screen and you can modify things from here, including canceling subscriptions or resetting eligibility for purchases. And before I am at the very end of the talk, but I just want to mention one more thing that way beyond the scope of this talk is there's also StoreKit testing frameworks for unit testing. And this is very exciting if you do unit testing at all, because this lets you fully control unit testing for StoreKit, including modifying any kind of transactions in the same way that you could through those Xcode testing tools. You can do through unit testing, including manipulation of the StoreKit confirmation dialogues in StoreKit UI tests. So if you have UI sort of unit tests, you can modify those too. So just be aware that there's this whole SK test session and StoreKit testing framework that you can look into and make use of if you do unit testing now or in the future. So with that, I'd like to thank you for coming to my talk. You can find out more about Nami, our SDK for handling StoreKit transaction stuff for you, at nami.ml. It also handles the paywall generation, which is kind of nice because it will automatically build up paywalls for you if you want, or you can define your own custom paywalls. You could also go look for that at the our GitHub repository for that framework. Then you can, if you wish later on about this talk or about any iOS questions in general, feel free to contact me at kendall.gelner@namiml.com. And I'm also on Twitter at KendallDevDiary. And I post from time to time about purely Xcode related things. So it's a very low noise account where I just kind of do Xcode related things there, or just iOS development stuff in general. And thanks again for attending my talk, and hope you have a great conference.